The night felt ordinary. Highway noise, a buzzing neon sign, a motel room that could have belonged to anyone. Until morning arrived and one small detail didn't fit. The shoes were still there. No broken door, no shattered glass, no screams, no trace. Just an empty bed and a silence that grew heavier with every second. A child didn't vanish with struggle, but with routine sounds nobody remembered clearly. Footsteps in the walkway, doors opening and closing, engines starting before dawn. And when police asked the simplest question, asterisk, when did you last see him? Asterisk. Every answer carried the same terrifying truth. Nobody was sure. The motel sat just far enough off the highway that the noise of passing cars never fully faded, but never quite arrived either. It existed in a constant in-between, a low hum of tires on asphalt, a restless whisper that seeped through thin walls and rattled the edges of sleep. On that night in 1984, the neon sign outside flickered like it always did, one letter dimmer than the rest, buzzing faintly as if struggling to remember its own purpose. Travelers came and went here without ceremony. Names were written down. Keys were handed over, and by morning, most people were already gone, folded back into the anonymity of the road. He arrived late, later than most. The clerk would remember that much, though memory softened the details over time. A man in his early 30s, maybe mid-30s. Age had a way of blurring when nothing dramatic anchored it. He wore a jacket that had seen better days and carried a single bag. Not heavy, not light. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who had driven for hours with the radio low. Lost in thoughts he didn't feel the need to share. The clerk slid the register across the counter, the paper beneath already filled with other names, other nights. He signed neatly, paid in cash, and accepted the key without comment. No small talk, no complaints. Just a nod, polite and brief, as if he understood that this place was meant to be passed through, not remembered. The clerk would later say there was nothing strange about him at all, and that was what felt strangest in hindsight. The room was on the second floor, facing the parking lot. From the window, you could see the soda machine glowing like a small altar against the darkness, its mechanical side breaking the silence every few minutes. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet, the kind of smell that clung to everything but never announced itself. The bedspread was patterned with faded colors meant to look cheerful. The television sat bolted to a wooden stand, its screen dark and dusty. The bathroom light flickered when switched on, hesitating before fully committing. He set his bag down near the bed and took off his jacket, draping it over the chair. His movements were unremarkable, almost methodical. Shoes off, wallet placed on the nightstand, keys beside it. A man preparing to sleep, nothing more. No sense of urgency, no hint of finality. If he felt anything unusual that night, it stayed inside him. Outside, a truck rolled past, its headlights briefly sweeping across the curtains like a slow, searching gaze. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The motel breathed the way it always did. Quietly, imperfectly, alive only because people occupied it for a few hours at a time. At some point, he lay down on the bed. The sheets creased under his weight. The pillow flattened. He stared at the ceiling, perhaps counting the faint cracks in the paint or listening to the murmur of voices drifting up from the parking lot. Maybe he thought about where he had been that day. Maybe he thought about where he was going next. Or maybe he thought about nothing at all, letting exhaustion pull him under. No one knows what time he fell asleep. No one knows if he slept deeply, or if he woke again during the night. There were no witnesses to mark the passing hours, no clocks that mattered enough to remember. Time moved forward anyway, indifferent to the significance it would later carry. What is known is this: he did not check out. The night passed without incident. The clerk changed shifts. A few guests left before sunrise, engines coughing to life in the cool morning air. Others slept on, wrapped in dreams that would dissolve by noon. The motel returned to its daytime rhythm, quieter now, almost subdued. When morning came fully, sunlight spilled across the parking lot, revealing dust on windshields and oil stains on the pavement. Birds perched on the telephone wires, chirping as if nothing had ever gone wrong in this place. The neon sign switched off, its glow replaced by the pale certainty of day. The door to his room remained closed. Inside that room, everything stayed exactly where it had been. The bed showed signs of use. The sheets rumpled just enough to suggest a restless sleeper. His jacket still hung over the chair. The wallet still rested on the nightstand, cash tucked neatly inside, identification untouched. The bag sat where he had placed it, unzipped just enough to show folded clothes. The television had not been turned on. The bathroom sink was dry. There were no signs of panic, no broken glass, no blood, no hurried packing, no note. It was as if the room itself had paused, waiting for him to return and complete the simple act of leaving. But he didn't. Hours passed. Then more. The motel staff followed routine, knocking softly on doors, calling out when it was time for checkout. When no answer came from his room, it didn't immediately raise concern. People overslept. People stepped out for breakfast. People ignored knocks all the time. It wasn't until later, when the door was finally opened, that the absence revealed itself fully, not as a dramatic discovery, but as a quiet wrongness that settled in the chest. A room occupied by someone who was no longer there. A presence reduced to objects. A life interrupted mid-pause. Somewhere between the moment he lay down and the moment the door was open again, he vanished. Not slowly, not gradually, completely. And that is where the story begins. Not with a scream, not with violence, not with chaos, but with a man who checked into a motel like 1,000 others before him, closed the door behind him, and then, without explanation, slipped out of the world he was known to inhabit. No one saw him leave. No one heard him go. The road outside kept humming. The motel kept breathing. And the night swallowed whatever truth it was offered, leaving only silence behind. Before the motel, before the flickering neon and the unanswered questions, his life moved along in quiet, predictable lines. He was not a man people watched closely. He did not command rooms or leave impressions that lingered long after he'd gone. He existed comfortably in the background of other people's lives, dependable and steady, the kind of person whose absence would feel wrong long before it felt alarming. He woke up early most mornings, not because he had to, but because his body was used to it. Years of routine had trained him that way. Coffee came first, always the same brand, poured into the same chip mug that had survived several moves without ever being replaced. He listened to the radio while he dressed, not really paying attention to the news so much as the comfort of familiar voices filling the silence. Silence, when it stretched too long, had a way of pressing it on him. He worked a job that required more patience than passion, the kind of work that kept the lights on without feeding the soul. His co-workers would later struggle to describe him beyond generalities. Reliable, quiet, polite. He showed up on time. He didn't complain. He didn't cause problems. If there were frustrations simmering beneath the surface, he kept them well hidden, folded neatly alongside everything else he chose not to share. There were no rumors surrounding him, no whispered scandals, no debts that anyone knew about. He wasn't running from anything obvious. He paid his bills, returned calls when necessary, and maintained just enough social connection to avoid being labeled a loner. But there was a distance about him, a gentle reserve that made it hard to say how well anyone truly knew him. He had friends, though most of them were situational. People connected by proximity rather than intimacy. Conversation stayed on safe ground. Work, weather, small complaint about traffic, or rising prices. He laughed when expected to, nodded in the right places. If someone asked how he was doing, he answered honestly but briefly. Fine, tired, busy. Words that closed doors instead of opening them. His family saw him less often than they wished, but not so rarely that it raised concern. Phone calls were irregular, but warm enough. Holidays were attended when schedules aligned. He showed up with gifts, stayed for the expected amount of time, and left with hugs that felt sincere even if they weren't lingering. There were no explosive arguments in his past, no estrangements marked by bitterness. Just a slow drift that happens when lives move in slightly different directions. If there was tension in his life, it was the quiet kind, the kind that settles in slowly without demanding attention, a sense that something hadn't turned out the way it was supposed to. He had once talked about plans, about places he might go someday, about changes he intended to make. Over time, those conversations faded, replaced by acceptance or perhaps resignation. Dreams didn't die dramatically for him. They simply stopped being discussed. He lived alone, in a modest space that reflected his personality. Clean, functional, sparse. No clutter, but no warmth either. Personal items were few and carefully arranged. Books he had read more than once. Photographs framed and dusted, but not displayed prominently. His home felt temporary, as if he never fully unpacked himself into it. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested he was preparing to disappear. He didn't give away belongings. He didn't withdraw from responsibilities. He didn't express fear or paranoia. In the days leading up to his trip, he followed his routine as usual, went to work, made plans that extended beyond the week, mentioned he'd be traveling briefly, nothing more. That detail would later become important. The fact that people expected him back. He had reasons to stay. Small ones, perhaps, but real. Commitments that anchored him to the world he occupied. People who would notice if he didn't return, even if they weren't watching closely enough to predict what would happen. When he packed for the trip, he did so efficiently. A change of clothes. Toiletries. Nothing excessive. Nothing sentimental. It wasn't the packing of someone leaving forever. It was the packing of someone who expected to be gone for a short while. His apartment remained intact, waiting for him in a way that now felt unbearably symbolic. Those who knew him would later replay their last interactions, searching for meaning where none had seemed necessary at the time. A casual goodbye, a brief phone call, a promise to catch up soon. Ordinary moments transformed into final memories, simply because there were no others to replace them. He wasn't a man burdened by visible despair. He didn't talk about wanting to escape his life. If he felt trapped, he carried it quietly, without performance. That made the theories harder later on. There was no obvious motive to cling to, no emotional confession to point toward. The idea that he might have chosen to vanish didn't sit easily with anyone who knew him. He valued order. He valued predictability. Disappearing without explanation required a kind of recklessness that didn't fit the man they remembered. And yet, something had drawn him onto that road. Something had led him to that motel on that particular night. Whether it was chance, necessity, or a decision made long before, no one could say. All that could be said was that his life, as it existed, did not appear to be collapsing. There were no visible cracks large enough to swallow a person whole. That absence of reason became its own kind of evidence, haunting in its simplicity. People vanish every day for clear, tragic reasons. This was not one of those stories. This was a man who fit into his world just well enough to leave behind questions instead of answers. In the years that followed, he would be remembered not for anything extraordinary he had done, but for the ordinary life he had lived. A life that offered no warning signs, no dramatic turning points, no final confessions. A life that seemed, from the outside, entirely incompatible with disappearance. And that was the most unsettling part. Not that he was gone, but that nothing about who he was seemed to explain why. Morning arrived without ceremony. It always did. The motel didn't wake up so much as it slowly became visible again, details emerging as the sun lifted itself over the horizon. Light crept across the parking lot, catching on windshields and chrome bumpers, illuminating the fine layer of dust that settled everywhere overnight. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of stale air and cleaning supplies, the echo of footsteps softened by worn carpet that had absorbed years of passing lives. Housekeeping began its round the same way it did every day, a cart rolling quietly. A checklist followed from room to room. Knock, announce, wait. Most doors opened easily. Guests already gone, beds stripped of their temporary occupants, trash waiting to be collected. A few people lingered, sleeping late, murmuring apologies through the door. Nothing about the routine suggested that this morning would be remembered. When the knock came at his door, there was no answer. At first, that meant nothing. People ignored knocks. People showered. People stepped out for coffee. The cart moved on, the moment forgotten almost as soon as it happened. Time passed in small, forgettable increments. The sun climbed higher. The parking lot thinned out as engines started and cars pulled away, one by one. It wasn't until later, when checkout time had long passed, that the absence began to feel slightly off. His car was still there, parked neatly in the same spot, its windows reflecting the bright, indifferent sky, a detail easy to overlook at first, but once noticed, difficult to ignore. Another knock, louder this time. A voice called out, polite but firm. Still nothing. The door was unlocked using a master key, the latch turning with a dull, familiar click. No one expected what they found, or rather, what they didn't find. The room was quiet, not the tense kind of quiet that follows disruption, but a stillness that felt preserved, as if the air itself had been waiting. The curtains were partially drawn, letting in thin bands of light that stretched across the carpet. Dust motes drifted lazily undisturbed. The bed told the first part of the story. Sheets wrinkled, pillows slightly out of place. Someone had slept here, not briefly, not casually. The indentation remained, as if his absence had happened moments ago rather than hours earlier. The nightstand held his wallet, open just enough to show cash and identification. Keys lay beside it, arranged without care, but not in haste. The jacket still hung over the chair, its sleeves dangling toward the floor. The bag sat near the bed, half-packed, clothes folded inside. Shoes rested by the door, untouched. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared missing. The television had not been turned on. The bathroom sink was dry, the towels unused. There was no note on the desk, no message scrawled on hotel stationery, no explanation left behind for anyone to follow. It was the kind of scene that made people hesitate, unsure whether they were overreacting. Perhaps he'd stepped out briefly. Perhaps he'd gone for breakfast and would return any minute. But the longer the room was observed, the more wrong it felt. People do not leave wallets behind when they plan to come back. People do not leave keys, identification, money, all the things that anchor them to their lives. Staff members exchanged glances. Someone mentioned calling the front desk. Someone else suggested waiting a little longer. But time had already passed, and the unease was beginning to settle in. The front desk clerk came up to the room, frowning as they took in the details. The register confirmed what everyone already suspected. He had checked in the night before. He had not checked out. There had been no phone calls from his room, no complaints, no requests. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, an understanding forming around the edges. He hadn't just stepped out. He wasn't running late. He was gone. Authorities were contacted, though without urgency at first. There was no crime scene to secure, no obvious emergency. Just a missing person and a room full of unanswered questions. An officer arrived, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the space with professional detachment. They asked the same questions everyone else had already been asking. When was he last seen? Who had spoken to him? Did anyone hear anything unusual during the night? The answers were unsatisfying. No one remembered anything out of the ordinary. No sounds of distress. No arguments. No late-night visitors. The officer examined the room more closely, noting the placement of objects, the condition of the bed, the absence of disturbance. They checked the windows. Locked. They checked the bathroom. Empty. The door itself showed no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had simply stood up and evaporated. Outside, his car remained untouched. The doors were locked. Nothing inside suggested he had prepared for a sudden departure. No packed bags. No map spread across the seat. No sign that he had driven away in a hurry, or at all. As the day wore on, the motel returned to its rhythm, though something had shifted beneath the surface. New guests arrived, unaware of what had happened just hours earlier. The room would soon need to be cleaned, reset, made anonymous again. But for now, it stood frozen in time, holding the last physical evidence of a man who had vanished. The strangeness of the situation deepened as more people became involved. Another officer arrived. Then another. Questions repeated. Notes compared. Still nothing emerged that explained how a person could disappear so completely from such a confined space. The absence became louder than any clue. Each object left behind seemed to insist on his presence. even as his body refused to be found. The room did not tell a story of escape or violence. It told a story of interruption. Somewhere between night and morning, something had changed the course of his life, or ended it, but the room gave no indication of what that something was. It offered no narrative, no clear sequence of events, just a pause mid-sentence. As the door was finally closed again, there was a sense that whatever had happened did not belong to the daylight, that the truth, whatever it was, had moved under cover of darkness, leaving behind only a shell of normalcy. The morning continued. The sun climbed higher. People checked in and out. The highway hummed. And in that motel room, a man's absence settled in, heavy and unresolved, marking the moment when an ordinary stay became the beginning of a mystery that would refuse to fade. The investigation began the way most did in the early hours of uncertainty, methodical, restrained, careful not to assume what could not yet be proven. There was no crime scene tape stretched across the motel hallway, no flashing lights drawing curious onlookers, just a handful of officers moving quietly through a space that felt more confusing than alarming. A man was missing, and at first, that was all anyone could say with confidence. They started with the obvious: his name, his address, his place of work. A phone call here, a question there. Each answer led to another question, and none of them led to him. The motel staff were interviewed one by one. The clerk described the check-in: late, calm, unremarkable. No visible distress. No unusual requests. Housekeeping repeated the story of the empty room, of belongings left behind. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard anything that stood out. The parking lot was examined next. Tire tracks overlapped in indistinguishable patterns. The lot served dozens of guests, and any trace of a single person's movement was quickly swallowed by the larger picture. His car sat where it had been the night before, locked, silent. Officers checked the trunk, the interior, under the seats. Nothing. The surrounding area offered little more. The motel sat near the highway, but not close enough for traffic cameras to catch every movement. Surveillance, where it existed at all, was limited and unreliable. Grainy footage from nearby businesses showed nothing useful. Shadows passed. Cars came and went. Faces blurred into anonymity. There was no clear image of him walking away, no time-stamped proof of direction. Detectives considered the possibility of foul play, but the evidence refused to cooperate. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no witnesses reporting an argument or a scream. The room itself contradicted the idea. Everything about it suggested calm, routine, sleep. If something violent had occurred, it had left no visible trace, and that absence made the theory harder to support. Another explanation emerged just as quickly: voluntary disappearance. It was the simplest answer, and often the most uncomfortable. Adults were allowed to walk away from their lives if they chose to. But this theory raised questions of its own. Why leave behind identification, money, keys? Why abandon a car? Why vanish in the middle of the night without preparation? People who planned to disappear usually took steps. This felt unplanned, abrupt, careless. Accident was also considered. Perhaps he had stepped outside briefly. Fresh air, a cigarette, a moment alone, and something had gone wrong. A fall, a medical emergency, an encounter no one witnessed. Searches were conducted in nearby areas. Ditches, wooded patches, abandoned lots. Nothing turned up. No body. No clothing. No trace that he had even been there. As days passed, the urgency began to fade, replaced by a dull persistence. Missing persons cases lived in a strange space between action and waiting. Detectives followed leads as they appeared, but there were few to follow. Phone records were checked. Bank activity was monitored. Nothing changed. No withdrawals. No calls. No signs of life beyond the motel room. The case file grew thicker, filled with notes that circled the same unanswered questions. Each theory contradicted another. Each possibility collapsed under scrutiny. It was as if the truth had slipped through a gap no one could see. Officers canvassed nearby businesses and residences, asking if anyone had noticed a man walking alone late at night. Descriptions were offered, vague and inconsistent. A man matching that description had been seen near the highway, or Maybe it was someone else. Memory, unreliable at the best of times, became even less dependable as days turned into weeks. The investigation reached outward, contacting hospitals, shelters, transit stations. His name did not appear. His face did not surface. It was as if he had crossed a boundary where records could no longer reach him. With no clear evidence of a crime, resources were limited. Other cases demanded attention. Cases with victims, with suspects, with urgency written plainly across them. This one resisted definition. It hovered in uncertainty, difficult to justify and impossible to solve. Internally, some investigators felt the weight of it more than others. A room that looked too normal. A man who didn't fit the patterns they relied on. Cases like this unsettled them, not because of what they showed, but because of what they refused to show. They challenged the idea that every disappearance left a trail. As time passed, the case began to shift from active investigation to open-ended file. Notes were updated less frequently. Leads dried up. Calls from family were answered with the same careful language. Still working on it. No new developments. Please let us know if you remember anything else. The motel room was cleaned and rented again. New guests slept in the same bed, unaware of the story embedded in the walls. The nightstand held different wallets now, different keys. The space absorbed the absence without protest. For the investigators, the unanswered questions lingered long after official momentum slowed. They returned to the file more than once, hoping time might reveal something they had missed. But time, in this case, only buried the trail deeper. Eventually, the investigation reached a quiet standstill. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, just a pause that stretched indefinitely. The disappearance remained unsolved, suspended in a place where logic failed to connect the dots. And so the case went nowhere, not because no one tried, but because every path led back to the same empty room, the same untouched belongings, the same impossible question. How does a person leave everything behind without leaving a trace? No answer came, only the slow realization that some mysteries resist even the most careful search, slipping through the spaces between certainty and doubt, leaving behind nothing but a file full of questions and a name that refused to be explained. When the investigation slowed, when the questions stopped producing new answers, the weight of his absence shifted onto the people who had known him best. For them, the disappearance was not an abstract puzzle or file number. It was a rupture that cut directly through their lives, reshaping everything that came after. At first, there was shock, the kind that feels unreal, as if someone has spoken a sentence incorrectly, and the world will correct itself if you wait long enough. His family replayed the phone calls in their minds, listening for something they might have missed. A hesitation, a strange tone, a pause that now seemed loaded with meaning. At the time, those conversations had felt ordinary. Now they were treated like fragile artifacts, examined again and again. They expected him to walk back into his life at any moment, to call and explain, to apologize for the worry, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. Days passed with that expectation intact. Then weeks. The phone stayed silent. The silence grew heavier, harder to carry. His parents struggled the most with the uncertainty. Grief usually offers a shape, a beginning and an end, a ritual that tells you what comes next. This gave them nothing. There was no funeral, no grave, no final moment to anchor their sorrow. Instead, they lived in a constant state of suspension, unable to fully mourn and unable to fully hope. They kept his room the same. Small decisions became monumental. Should they move his belongings? Should they leave the light on at night? Every choice felt like a betrayal, as if changing anything might somehow erase him or signal that they had given up. Time moved forward regardless, but emotionally, they remained stuck in the moment when they first learned he was missing. Friends felt the absence differently, but no less deeply. Some felt guilt for not knowing him better, for not asking more questions, for accepting his quiet nature without pushing past it. Others felt a strange defensiveness, bristling at theories that painted him as someone capable of simply walking away. They wanted to protect a version of him they knew, even as that version grew harder to reconcile with reality. Conversations about him became cautious. At first, his name came up often, stories shared, memories retold, laughter breaking through the tension. Over time, those conversations slowed. Not because he was forgotten, but because talking about him reopened wounds that never closed. His absence became an unspoken presence, felt more than discussed. Holidays were the hardest. Empty chairs took on unbearable significance. Birthdays arrived with no call, no card, no explanation. Each milestone passed without him marked another quiet loss. People aged. Children grew older. Life continued in ways that felt unfairly indifferent. Some family members clung to hope longer than others. They followed every lead, no matter how thin. They called hotlines. They scanned crowds. They imagined him living under a different name, somewhere far away, starting over. Hope became both a comfort and a curse, keeping grief at bay while prolonging the pain. Others began to accept a darker possibility, even if they could never fully articulate it. Acceptance came not as relief, but as exhaustion. The constant tension of not knowing took a toll. Sleep became difficult. Anxiety settled into daily life. The disappearance didn't just take him. It slowly took pieces of the people who loved him. There were moments when anger surfaced. Anger at the investigators for not finding answers. Anger at strangers who speculated without understanding. Anger at him, even, for leaving them in the state of limbo. That anger was often followed by guilt, a painful reminder that emotions do not obey logic. Over time, the world's response changed. At first, there was attention, concern, sympathy. People asked questions, offered help. As months turned into years, that attention faded. New stories replaced old ones. The disappearance became less urgent to everyone except those living inside it. That shift hurt more than anyone expected. It felt like losing him all over again, this time to indifference. The people he left behind were forced to carry the memory alone, without the reinforcement of shared concern. They learned how quickly the world moves on, even when you can't. Some relationships strained under the weight. Grief does not affect everyone the same way, and differences in coping created distance. Arguments erupted over how much hope was reasonable, how much searching was enough, how long one could live in uncertainty. Love remained, but it was reshaped by stress and sadness. Years passed, and his absence became woven into their identities. They were no longer just parents, siblings, friends. They were the ones who had lost someone without answers. It influenced how they saw the world. Less stable, less predictable, more fragile than they had once believed. There were moments of imagined reunion. Dreams where he returned unchanged, apologetic, alive. Waking from those dreams felt like losing him again. Reality reasserted itself. Heavy and unyielding. Despite everything, they kept him alive in small ways. Stories told quietly. His name spoken carefully. A photograph placed where it could be seen, but not stared at. These acts were not about refusing to let go. They were about refusing to let him disappear completely. The hardest part was not knowing which emotion was appropriate. Mourning felt premature. Hope felt foolish. Every feeling existed in contradiction to another. They learned to live in that contradiction, to function while carrying unresolved grief. For the people he left behind, the disappearance never ended. It did not resolve. It did not fade. It simply changed shape, settling into the background of their lives like a low, constant ache. They moved forward because they had to, but part of them remained frozen in time, forever waiting for an answer that might never come. And in that waiting, they discovered a truth few people ever confront, that absence can be more powerful than presence, and that not knowing can wound more deeply than any certainty. As official interest faded and the investigation settled into quiet inactivity, something else began to grow in its place. The absence left behind a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured speculation. People are uncomfortable with unanswered questions, and when certainty refuses to arrive, imagination steps in to fill the gaps. It started small. A comment overheard at a diner. A suggestion whispered between neighbors. Someone claimed they had seen a man who looked like him at a gas station miles away, days after the disappearance. Another insisted they remembered a stranger walking along the highway late that night, head down, moving with purpose. None of these accounts could be confirmed, but each one carried just enough detail to feel plausible. The story began to circulate locally, passed along in fragments that shifted with each retelling. Details blurred, timelines bent, facts mixed with assumptions, until it became difficult to separate what was known from what was believed. His name took on a strange permanence, lingering long after other disappearances had faded from memory. Theories emerged to explain what official channels could not. Some were grounded in logic, others driven by fear or fascination. One theory suggested he had been involved in something secretive, something that required him to disappear quickly and completely. People pointed to his quiet nature, his lack of close connections, as evidence that he had hidden more than anyone realized. Another theory leaned toward danger, that he had crossed paths with the wrong person, that the motel had been chosen precisely because it was anonymous and easy to vanish from. This idea gained traction despite the lack of physical evidence. It appealed to the human tendency to search for villains when confronted with chaos. There were darker interpretations as well. Some speculated that he had taken his own life, slipping out unnoticed to end his story somewhere no one would ever find him. This theory was whispered rather than spoken aloud, as if saying it too clearly might make it real. Those who knew him rejected it fiercely, clinging to their memories of a man who did not speak the language of despair. Others believed he had chosen a new life entirely, that he had shed his old identity like a skin and stepped into another, free from obligations and expectations. This theory offered a strange comfort to some, a version of the story where he was alive, even if unreachable. It painted the disappearance as an act of agency rather than tragedy. As the years passed, these theories multiplied rather than resolved. Each new detail, no matter how minor, was absorbed into the growing mythology. A reported sighting in another state, a man using a similar name, a face in a crowd that looked just close enough to spark hope. Amateur investigators began to take interest. They gathered information from public records, old news clippings, and word-of-mouth accounts. Some approached the case with genuine care, hoping to uncover something overlooked. Others treated it like a puzzle, an intellectual challenge divorced from the emotional reality of the people involved. Online forums and discussion boards eventually gave the mystery a new life. People who had never known him debated his fate with confidence, building narratives from fragments and speculation. His disappearance became content, something to be analyzed, dissected, and reshaped. This attention was a double-edged sword for those closest to him. On one hand, it meant he was not forgotten. On the other, it meant his life was being reimagined by strangers who knew him only as a mystery. The person they remembered, quiet, ordinary, human, was slowly replaced by a symbol of unanswered questions. Rumors took on a momentum of their own. Once introduced, they were difficult to correct. A single misinterpreted detail could spread widely, becoming accepted as fact simply through repetition. The truth, whatever it was, became increasingly obscured by layers of storytelling. Locals who had lived near the motel began to associate the place with the disappearance. The room gained a reputation, whispered about as unlucky or strange. New guests slept there unaware of the story, while long-time residents avoided it, as if absence itself might linger in the walls. Every so often, something would reignite interest. An anniversary, a brief mention in a newspaper, a new investigator reviewing old files. Each resurgence brought a flurry of renewed speculation, followed by the familiar disappointment when nothing concrete emerged. The name refused to die. It lingered in conversations and memories, refusing to settle into the past. For some, the mystery became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile normal life could be. For others, it was an obsession, a question that demanded an answer no matter how long it took. Over time, the line between the man and the mystery blurred. He was no longer just someone who had disappeared. He was a story people told to make sense of uncertainty. His real experiences, his real relationships, were overshadowed by imagined scenarios. This transformation was unsettling. It stripped him of his ordinariness, turning him into something larger and less human. The people who had loved him struggled with this version of him, feeling as though he was being taken from them again, this time by speculation. Yet even as rumors distorted the truth, they kept his memory alive. Silence would have been worse. Being forgotten would have meant his disappearance had truly erased him. As flawed as the theories were, They ensured that questions remained, that someone, somewhere, still wondered what happened. The longer the mystery endured, the more it reflected those who engaged with it. Fear, hope, suspicion, and imagination all found a place within the story. The disappearance became a mirror, revealing less about him and more about the human need for answers. And so the rumors persisted, evolving with time, growing more elaborate as facts remained scarce. His name became a placeholder for uncertainty, a reminder that not every story ends neatly, that some questions linger not because they are unsolvable, but because they refuse to let go of those who ask them. Eventually, without ceremony or announcement, the case slipped into a different category. Not solved, not resolved, simply inactive. The file was closed in the way many such files are, not because the truth had been uncovered, but because there was nothing left to pursue. No new leads, no fresh evidence, no direction forward. The disappearance was officially acknowledged as something the system could no longer actively hold. For law enforcement, this transition was procedural, a necessary narrowing of focus. Resources had limits, and cases with clear danger or visible progress demanded attention. This one had neither. It existed in a gray area where effort no longer produced movement. The paperwork reflected that reality with clinical language that softened the blow. Pending further information, inactive status, open-ended. For those who loved him, that shift felt like abandonment. They were informed gently, carefully, as if tone could lessen the impact. The words were familiar by then. No new developments. We will notify you if anything changes. Please contact us if you remember anything else. The conversation ended the same way it always had. But this time, there was a finality beneath it that no one wanted to name. The closing of the file did not close the question. It did not quiet the ache. It simply marked a moment when responsibility quietly transferred from institutions to individuals, from official channels to private memory. Life, indifferent and relentless, continued to move forward. Calendars turned. Seasons repeated themselves. The world did not pause for unresolved absence. It never does. For those still carrying the weight of not knowing, this was perhaps the most difficult lesson to absorb, that the world would keep going even if their answers never came. The disappearance began to change shape again, not through new information, but through distance. Years stretched between the present and that night at the motel, creating a strange distortion. Memories softened at the edges. Some details faded. Others grew sharper, polished by repetition and longing. People noticed that when they spoke about him, they used past tense more often than they intended to. The correction, when it came, was subtle but painful. Language betrayed them in small ways, nudging them toward acceptance even when they resisted it. There were moments when the silence felt heavier than ever. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. Anniversaries of the disappearance came and went with quiet rituals no one else saw. A candle lit, a walk taken alone, a pause held longer than necessary. Friends hesitated before bringing him up, unsure whether mentioning his name would offer comfort or reopen wounds. Over time, many stopped mentioning him at all, not out of forgetfulness, but out of fear of causing pain. The absence became isolating in a new way, carried quietly, privately, without witnesses. The case file sat on a shelf somewhere, indistinguishable from dozens of others like it. A name on a spine, a collection of papers that once represented urgency, now representing uncertainty. It waited patiently for a reason to be open again, though no one expected one to arrive. Occasionally, something would stir hope. A phone call from an unknown number. A news story about remains found elsewhere. A vague resemblance in a photograph. Each time, hearts lifted cautiously, only to settle back into disappointment when the lead dissolved. Hope became something to manage carefully, rationed to avoid collapse. Over time, the people he left behind learned how to live with the unanswered question rather than against it. This was not acceptance in the traditional sense. It was adaptation, a quiet restructuring of life around a missing piece that would never quite fit. They learned to function while carrying uncertainty, to laugh while holding sorrow, to plan for futures that still felt incomplete. It was not strength in the dramatic sense. It was endurance. The disappearance began to feel less like an event and more like a condition, something chronic, something permanent. It colored decisions in subtle ways, made the world feel less predictable, less safe. It taught them that certainty was fragile, that normal life could fracture without warning. For law enforcement, the case became something they remembered occasionally, usually when encountering similar circumstances. A motel, an empty room, belongings left behind. Each resemblance stirred a brief echo of frustration, a reminder of a mystery that refused to yield. But reminders did not reopen investigations. Without new evidence, the case remained what it was, an unresolved disappearance with no clear path forward. The motel itself changed over time. New paint, new management, renovations that erased the physical traces of that night. Guests slept there unaware that the room had once held a moment where someone slipped out of the known world. Absence does not leave marks that renovations can preserve. And yet, for those who knew the story, the place remained charged. It existed as a fixed point in memory, a location forever linked to a question that followed them everywhere. As years turned into decades, the disappearance became part of the family history, spoken of in quieter tones, sometimes to people too young to remember when it happened. The story was passed down carefully, stripped of speculation, anchored only to what was known. He went there. He didn't come back. No one knows why. That uncertainty shaped how they spoke about life, about plans, about the future. It introduced caution where there had once been confidence. It reminded them that even the most ordinary lives could intersect with the inexplicable. The case may have been closed on paper, but emotionally, it never was. It lingered in the background of every year that followed, a low, persistent presence that refused to fade completely. There was no resolution to lean on, no truth to accept or reject, only the long, quiet reality of not knowing, stretched across time. And in that space, between official closure and personal continuation, the question remained exactly where it had always been, waiting. Time has a way of erasing urgency, while deepening meaning. As the years stretched onward, the disappearance slipped further from the present, but it did not loosen its grip. Instead, it settled into a different rhythm, quieter and more pervasive, like a low-frequency hum that could no longer be heard clearly but was always felt. The world changed around the absence. Technology advanced. Streets were renamed. Businesses closed and reopened under different signs. The highway near the motel was repaved, widened, its exits reshaped to accommodate traffic that moved faster than it once had. People began carrying phones in their pockets, then small computers, then entire digital lives. Photographs became endless. Information became instant. And still, the question remained unanswered. For those who remembered him, time became divided into before and after, even decades later. The distance from that night in 1984 grew, so large it became difficult to comprehend. 39 years was long enough for children to become adults, for adults to become grandparents. Long enough for memories to fade in ways that felt both natural and cruel. Some details slipped away despite every effort to hold on to them. The exact sound of his voice, the way he laughed when surprised, the rhythm of his footsteps. Memory, no matter how fiercely guarded, softened with time. What remained were impressions rather than specifics, emotions rather than images. There was a strange guilt attached to forgetting, as if allowing any detail to fade meant losing him again. Those closest to him held on to what they could, repeating stories aloud not just to share them, but to preserve them. Each retelling became an act of resistance against time's quiet erosion. The disappearance itself aged differently. What had once felt immediate and raw became historical, referenced by dates and time spans rather than emotions. To outsiders, it was something that happened long ago. To those who lived with it, it was still unfolding. Every year that passed without answers subtly changed the nature of hope. Early on, hope had been urgent and active, driven by searches, phone calls, and imagined reunions. Later, it became quieter, less specific. No longer focused on scenarios, just on the idea that something might one day make sense. There were moments when the passage of time felt like an accusation. 39 years was long enough for someone to have built an entire life elsewhere. long enough for possibilities to feel both endless and exhausted, long enough for the absence to become permanent without ever being explained. The silence of those years carried its own weight. No letters, no sightings that held up, no accidental crossings of paths. It was as if the world had swallowed him completely and refused to offer anything back. New generations grew up hearing fragments of story. To them, it sounded unreal, almost fictional. A man vanishing from a motel room before security cameras, before cell phones, before digital footprints. They asked questions with curiosity rather than pain, unaware of how sharp those questions still felt to people answering them. Sometimes the story was told carefully, softened at the edges. Other times, it was told bluntly, stripped down to the facts. He went there. He didn't come back. No one knows why. The simplicity of the statement belied the complexity it carried. The motel itself became less central over time, its physical presence overshadowed by what it represented. The place no longer mattered as much as the moment. The disappearance was no longer tied to a room or a parking lot, but to the idea that someone could step out of their life and never be traced again. As the years accumulated, the absence grew heavier in unexpected ways. It shaped how people thought about safety, about endings, about certainty. It planted a quiet awareness that not everything unresolved would eventually be resolved, that some questions simply endure. There were long stretches when nothing stirred the memory at all. Life demanded attention elsewhere. Work, family, illness, joy, grief unrelated to him. The disappearance receded into the background, not forgotten, but dormant. Then something small would bring it rushing back. A motel sign glimpsed from the road. A name spoken aloud. A story on the news about another person who vanished without explanation. These moments collapsed time, pulling the past into the present with startling clarity. 39 years was also long enough for perspective to shift. What once felt like an interruption began to feel like a defining feature. The absence was no longer an anomaly. It was part of the fabric of life. It influenced how people measured time, how they defined closure, how they understood loss. The unanswered question became less about what happened and more about what it meant. What did it mean to live with uncertainty for decades? What did it mean to love someone whose story had no ending? These questions had no solutions, only reflections. Some days, the silence felt peaceful, a rest from constant wondering. Other days, it felt unbearable, a reminder that the truth might never come. Both feelings coexisted, often within the same hour. The discovery did not arrive with urgency or intention. It wasn't the result of renewed focus or a determined investigator reopening old files. It came quietly, almost apologetically, as if aware it was disturbing a silence that had held for decades. The kind of discovery that happens not because someone is looking, but because time shifts something loose. It began with something ordinary, a routine process. Paperwork being revisited, property changing hands, records being digitized. A task meant to organize the past, not resurrect it. Someone noticed a detail that didn't quite align, a fragment that had been overlooked not out of negligence, but because it hadn't mattered enough at the time. At first, it seemed insignificant, a name appearing where it shouldn't, a reference buried in documents that had never been cross-checked against anything meaningful. It was the kind of thing most people would skim past without pause. But something about it lingered, tugging gently at curiosity. The discovery didn't announce itself as an answer. It didn't arrive labeled as truth. It arrived as a question. As the fragment was examined more closely, its implications began to widen. Dates were compared. Locations aligned in ways they hadn't before. The timeline that had once ended abruptly now showed a faint extension. Thin, fragile, but undeniably there. What made it unsettling was not what it immediately revealed, but what it suggested. That the disappearance might not have ended where everyone believed it had. That the silence of 39 years might not have been empty after all. The information was handled cautiously. There was an awareness that reopening the past carried consequences. For those who had lived with uncertainty, even the possibility of answers could be destabilizing. Hope, after so many years, was not something to be introduced lightly. When the discovery was finally acknowledged as significant, It sent a quiet ripple outward, not a wave, a tremor, enough to disturb the settled dust of decades. Those closest to the disappearance were contacted carefully. The language was deliberate, restrained. New information had surfaced. It might be relevant. It needed to be examined further. No promises were made. No conclusions offered. Hearing those words after so many years felt unreal, as if time had folded in on itself, pulling them back to a place they had learned to survive without revisiting. Old emotions surfaced instantly, raw despite their age. Hope flared cautiously, accompanied by fear just as sharp. The discovery forced everyone to confront something they hadn't prepared for, the possibility that the story wasn't finished. As the details emerged, they challenged long-held assumptions. The idea that nothing had happened after that motel night began to crack. The absence of evidence was no longer proof of absence. It was proof of limitation, of what hadn't been visible, accessible, or prioritized at the time. The fragment suggested movement, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to imply continuation. A record tied to a location far from the motel. A connection that hadn't existed before. A moment in time that overlapped too closely to ignore. Investigators approached the new information with measured skepticism. Years of dead ends had trained them to temper expectations. Still, they couldn't dismiss what was in front of them. The details fit together too cleanly, too plausibly. As they followed this new thread, the story began to reshape itself. The disappearance no longer looked like a single moment frozen in time. It began to resemble a sequence, unfinished, fragmented, but real. What made the discovery so powerful was its ordinariness. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve a confession or a sudden revelation. It was simply something that had been missed, overlooked in an era when information moved slowly and connections were harder to make. That realization carried its own weight. The idea that answers might have been sitting quietly in the background all along, unnoticed, reframed the entire mystery. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about how easily lives could slip through the cracks of imperfect systems. For the people who had waited for decades, the discovery reopened wounds they had learned to live with. The past surged forward, demanding attention. Old questions returned, sharper now, joined by new ones that felt even more difficult. What if he hadn't vanished completely? What if his story had continued somewhere else, unseen? What if the silence had been hiding something rather than representing nothing? At the same time, dread crept in. Discoveries do not always bring comfort. Sometimes they bring clarity that hurts more than not knowing. After so many years of imagining possibilities, the reality, whatever it was, threatened to collapse them all into something fixed and irreversible. As investigators traced the implications of the find, they moved carefully, aware of the emotional stakes. Each step forward carried the potential to rewrite decades of belief. The absence that had defined so many lives was no longer stable. The discovery also attracted renewed attention from outside. The mystery resurfaced in quiet conversations, then louder ones. People who had once speculated returned with new energy. The story, dormant for so long, began to breathe again. But this time felt different. This wasn't rumor or theory. This was tangible, documented, real enough to demand reconsideration. What unsettled everyone most was how accidental it all felt. 39 years of silence, broken not by determination or persistence, but by chance. It suggested that the truth had not been hidden deliberately. It had simply waited, patient and unmoved, until the right moment to be seen. The discovery did not answer everything. In fact, it raised more questions than it resolved. But it changed the shape of the mystery in a way that could not be undone. The disappearance was no longer confined to that motel room, no longer frozen in a single night. Something had happened after, something that left a trace. As the evidence was examined more closely, the shape of the truth began to emerge. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in fragments that resisted comfort. What had once been an empty space in the timeline now filled with partial clarity, and that clarity carried weight far heavier than speculation ever had. The discovery did not point to a single dramatic answer. There was no moment that explained everything. Instead, there was a slow reconstruction, like piecing together a structure from scattered remains. Records were verified, dates aligned, locations were confirmed. Each confirmation narrowed the range of possibilities, quietly closing doors that had remained open for decades. What became clear first was movement. He had not vanished into nothingness that night. He had gone somewhere. Not far, perhaps, but far enough to escape notice. The idea that he had simply ceased to exist at the motel no longer held. His story extended beyond that room, beyond that parking lot, into a stretch of time that had gone undocumented. That realization alone was enough to shake long-held beliefs. For years, the mystery had revolved around the impossibility of leaving without a trace. Now it became evident that the trace had existed. It just hadn't been recognized for what it was. The evidence suggested that the hours after his disappearance were not chaotic or violent. There was no indication of a struggle, no signs of coercion. Instead, what emerged was a picture of quiet continuation. Ordinary actions, mundane decisions, the kind that rarely draw attention and are easily forgotten. This reframed everything. If he had left willingly, even briefly, it raised uncomfortable questions. Not accusations, but uncertainties. What had driven him to step away without telling anyone? Why leave behind the things that defined him? His identification, his money, his connections. Why sever himself so completely from the life he had built? The evidence did not provide motives. It did not explain his state of mind. It simply placed him somewhere else, at another moment in time, alive beyond the point everyone believed his story had ended. For those who had waited for decades, this was both a revelation and a burden. Hope surged instinctively, even as logic urged restraint. Knowing it continued on did not mean knowing where he went next, or how his story concluded. Further examination brought darker clarity. While the evidence suggested survival beyond the motel, it also suggested limitation. The trail did not stretch far. It did not lead to a new life carefully constructed over years. It hinted at transience, instability, vulnerability. There were signs that whatever path he had taken was not one of freedom or reinvention. It was not the story of someone escaping into a better version of themselves. It was a story of someone drifting. That realization cut deeply. For years, some had comforted themselves with the idea that he might be living quietly somewhere, choosing distance over explanation. The evidence now challenged that hope. It suggested a life that became smaller, not larger, less anchored, not more. The truth, when it took shape, did not arrive with justice or resolution. There were no arrests to be made, no confessions to be heard, no moment where everything snapped into place. Instead, there was understanding, partial, fragile, and irreversible. What the evidence ultimately revealed was not a single event, but a gradual unraveling. A man stepping out of one life, without fully stepping into another. A disappearance not marked by drama, but by quiet disconnection. This was harder to accept than any violent explanation. Violence offers villains, clear lines of blame. This offered none. It offered only the uncomfortable possibility that his disappearance was shaped by factors no one could see clearly at the time. Internal struggles, unspoken fears, pressures that never rose to the surface. The people who loved him were forced to reevaluate their memories, not to doubt them, but to see them differently. The quiet moments, the reserved conversations, the way he kept parts of himself private. None of it screamed crisis, but together, it suggested a man carrying more than he shared. The truth did not absolve the pain of not knowing. It transformed it. The mystery was no longer about what happened in that room, but about what happened inside him. Questions shifted from where he went to why he felt the need to leave it all. And still, there were gaps, critical ones. The evidence could only reach so far. It illuminated a stretch of time, not an ending. The final chapter of his life remained unwritten, or at least unreadable. For investigators, this was a rare kind of resolution. The case was no longer entirely unknown, but it was not solved in the way cases are meant to be. There was no certainty to present, only probability. No closure to offer, only context. For his family, the truth was both grounding and destabilizing. It replaced imagined horrors with a quieter sadness. It confirmed that he had been alive beyond the moment they lost him, but also confirmed that whatever followed was not a life that circled back to them. The motel room looks smaller when you return to it in memory. Not physically smaller, but compressed by everything now known. What once felt like an empty stage becomes crowded with meaning, each object heavier than it was before. The bed is no longer just where he slept. It is where a version of his life paused, uncertain whether it would ever resume. The nightstand is no longer incidental furniture. It is a marker, holding the last things that tied him unmistakably to who he had been. Revisiting that room after the truth emerged changes the way the story breathes. The flickering neon outside no longer feels ominous in a symbolic way. It feels indifferent. The room did not trap him. It did not witness violence. It simply existed at the edge of a decision, unaware of the weight it would come to carry. The quiet that once felt unsettling now feels revealing. The absence of chaos was not proof of mystery. It was proof of transition. He did not vanish in panic. He did not flee in terror. He left quietly, slipping past the expectations that bind people predictable paths. That realization reframes the room entirely. The jacket over the chair becomes a symbol of interruption rather than escape, not something abandoned with intent, but something left behind because the future had not yet crystallized. The wallet on the nightstand, untouched, suggests not recklessness but detachment, a moment when identity itself felt negotiable, when the object that defined him no longer felt essential enough to carry forward. Standing in that space now, with decades of reflection layered over it, the room feels less like a crime scene and more like a threshold, a narrow point between certainty and uncertainty, between a life that had structure and one that would not. What becomes most striking is how ordinary everything remains. There is no grand symbolism embedded in the decor, no hidden message in the carpet pattern or the view from the window. It is painfully normal, and that normalcy underscores the truth more than any dramatic revelation ever could. The room did not force him to disappear. It simply marked a moment when he stepped beyond the version of himself everyone else recognized. The door did not close behind him as a barrier. It closed as punctuation. Returning to beginning with this understanding softens some questions and sharpens others. How many times had he stood on similar thresholds before unnoticed? How many small moments of disconnection had accumulated quietly, without alarm, until the idea of stepping away no longer felt impossible? The motel room becomes a mirror held up to the past, reflecting not just his final night there, but the long chain of ordinary days that led to it. The quiet job, the polite conversations, the unexpressed weight, none of it dramatic enough to intervene, all of it significant enough to matter. For those who loved him, this reframing is both gentler and more painful. Gentler because it removes the fear of violence, of sudden harm. More painful because it suggests a loneliness that existed alongside them, unseen. The idea that he could reach that moment without anyone realizing how close he was to stepping away leaves a different kind of ache. The room does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply holds space for the realization that disappearance is not always an act of escape from danger, but sometimes an act of withdrawal from self. Looking back, the signs were not warnings. They were silences. And silence is easy to misunderstand, especially when it wears the mask of normalcy. The motel room becomes a place where time folds inward, the past and present overlap. The man who arrived late that night exists alongside the knowledge of where his path would lead, even if the details remain incomplete. That overlap creates a quiet tension that never fully resolves. There is something unsettling about how little the room resists reinterpretation. It accommodates every version of the story because it never insisted on one. It allowed the mystery to grow because it never contradicted it. The space itself has changed over the years. Renovations, new paint, different furniture. But those changes feel superficial compared to the permanence of the moment it once held. The physical room may be altered, but the idea of it remains fixed. When the story circles back here, it no longer feels like a beginning. It feels like a hinge, a small, unremarkable place where two versions of life briefly touched before separating. The man who checked in that night did not know how the story would be told decades later. He did not know his absence would become a question people carried for nearly 40 years. He did not know that a room meant for rest would become a symbol of unresolved transition. And yet, everything points back to this place, not because it holds answers, but because it holds context. It reminds us that disappearance does not require spectacle. It requires only a moment where leaving feels easier than staying. The motel room, revisited, does not offer closure. It offers perspective. It asks us to reconsider what we think we recognize in the people around us.